Lauren Mitchell sat behind the wheel, steady hands gripping the leather, heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. Brent Holloway sat in his patrol car behind her, smirking as he reached for his radio, convinced he had already won. One of them knew exactly what was happening. The other was about to realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The night was quiet, the streets nearly empty, except for the steady hum of passing cars on the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia. Lauren Mitchell drove with precision, her hands at 10 and 2, the glowing dashboard of her black SUV illuminating the calm expression on her face. She had driven this route countless times before, and nothing about this night seemed different, until she noticed the headlights trailing her too closely. A glance in the rearview mirror confirmed her suspicion. A patrol car following at an almost aggressive distance, its presence heavy and deliberate. The moment she flicked on her turn signal and changed lanes, the red and blue lights flashed. A sharp sigh left her lips. Not tonight, she thought. Pulling over smoothly, she placed her hands on the wheel and waited. She knew the drill. The officer approached slowly, his flashlight beaming into the side mirror, reflecting harshly against her skin. The knock on the window came harder than necessary. She rolled it down, keeping her movements slow and precise. License and registration. His voice was sharp, commanding. She turned to look at him, taking in the sharp jawline, the squared shoulders. He wasn't particularly tall, but his posture exuded authority, the kind that demanded immediate compliance. She reached for her purse with deliberate movements, her pulse steady, retrieving the documents before handing them over. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, flipping through her license. "I don't, officer," she responded evenly. "You failed to signal before turning." That wasn't true. She knew it, and so did he. But this was not the place to argue. She simply nodded. The officer studied her face longer than necessary before stepping back toward his vehicle. She exhaled, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel as she waited. The minutes stretched longer than they should have. When he finally returned, his expression had changed. "Step out of the vehicle." Lauren didn't move. She kept her gaze locked onto his, her mind assessing the situation rapidly. There was no reason for this escalation. She had provided her documents, answered his questions, and remained calm. "Is there a reason I need to exit my vehicle, officer?" Her tone remained measured. He shifted his weight, his hand resting near his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." The words held weight, a warning. Behind him, another patrol car had pulled up, and two more officers were approaching. She felt the energy shift. This wasn't a simple traffic stop anymore. She unbuckled her seatbelt, moving carefully as she pushed open the door and stepped onto the pavement. The air was cool against her skin. She turned toward the officer, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The next moments happened too fast. An arm yanked hers behind her back, the cold steel of handcuffs snapping against her wrists before she could process the movement. The pressure on her shoulders was forceful, meant to dominate, not restrain. A hand gripped her arm tightly as she was shoved against the SUV. "You're under arrest," the officer said flatly. "For what?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rough handling. "Resisting." A murmur spread through the small crowd that had begun to form on the sidewalk. Someone had their phone raised, recording. Lauren didn't fight. She didn't struggle. She simply looked over her shoulder, directly into the eyes of the officer gripping her arm. "You have no idea what you just did." They ignored her. They always did. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras lowered, but ready, waiting for the moment this case would take an unexpected turn. Local activists filled the seats behind the defense table, their expressions tense. The arrest had sparked outrage, and now everyone wanted to see what justice, if any, would look like for Lauren Mitchell. She sat motionless, her back straight, eyes forward, dressed in a navy blue suit that projected quiet confidence. Across from her, Officer Brent Holloway leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his mouth curled into a faint smirk. He had been through this before. Another defendant claiming they had been mistreated, another routine day in court. He had seen people cry, yell, beg, and argue. It never changed the outcome. His confidence showed in the way he carried himself, the way he casually shifted his weight as if he already knew he had won. The prosecutor began, painting the arrest as standard procedure. Lauren Mitchell had been pulled over for a simple traffic violation, but instead of complying, she had refused to exit the vehicle, delaying the officer's duty and forcing law enforcement to act. The prosecutor made it sound effortless, as if the responsibility for the entire encounter rested solely on her shoulders. Then came Holloway's turn to testify. He recounted the night with the ease of someone who had repeated the same version multiple times. She had hesitated, made the officers feel uneasy, refused to follow commands. He emphasized that she had been non-compliant and combative in attitude. A few chuckles rumbled through the police officers sitting in the gallery, their support for him unwavering. Then it was Lauren's turn. She stood, walked to the witness stand with measured steps, and took her oath. The room quieted as she began speaking, her voice calm, controlled. She explained each step of that night in meticulous detail. She had handed over her documents, had asked a simple question regarding why she needed to step out of the car, and had been forcibly removed without cause. Her attorney then played the footage. Clear, undeniable proof of how she had been yanked from the vehicle, how she had asked for a reason, how she had been slammed against the car without resistance. The courtroom murmured, but Holloway remained unfazed. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something with a small, dismissive shake of his head. That was when the chuckle slipped out. It was soft, almost under his breath, but audible enough to cut through the courtroom tension. A quick laugh, careless, dismissive. It said everything without words, that this was nothing, that her defense was a joke, that it was just another defendant trying to spin a narrative. The judge lifted his head, a warning flickering in his eyes, but it wasn't needed. Lauren didn't react, not yet. She reached down, pulled open a folder, and retrieved a single item. She placed it on the table before her, angled just enough for the judge and the prosecution to see. A badge. Not just any badge, a United States Secret Service badge. The reaction was instant. The laughter died. The smirk disappeared. Holloway stiffened, his arms unfolding, his body tensing. The weight of what he had done sank in, and for the first time he looked uncertain. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The golden badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its presence commanding more authority than any words could. The judge's expression shifted from mild impatience to sharp interest. The prosecutor's confident stance wavered. Even the court clerk, who had been absent-mindedly typing notes, stopped to glance up. But the most noticeable reaction came from Officer Brent Holloway. His body stiffened, his smirk evaporated, and his eyes locked onto the badge as if seeing a ghost. His breathing changed, shallow, controlled, an attempt to keep his composure. Moments ago, he had been the one in control, dismissing Lauren Mitchell's testimony with quiet amusement. Now, something colder replaced his arrogance. Realization. Lauren's attorney lifted the badge and turned it slightly for the room to see. The official documentation followed, a stack of papers bearing the seal of the United States Secret Service. The judge adjusted his glasses, leaning forward to scan the credentials, his fingers drumming lightly against the bench. This wasn't just some claim. It was fact. Lauren Mitchell was not just a civilian caught in an unfortunate traffic stop. She was a high-ranking federal agent, one who had worked on presidential security details, counterfeiting investigations, and criminal operations far beyond the reach of a small-town officer like Holloway. The prosecutor cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice measured, "can you confirm your current role within the Secret Service?" Lauren didn't look at him. She kept her gaze on Holloway. "I hold a supervisory position in the agency's investigative division." The weight of her words sank in. People in the courtroom exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Reporters scribbled faster. The police officers who had been chuckling earlier now sat rigid, some looking away, others pretending to check their phones. Her attorney continued, flipping through the pages of her credentials. "Miss Mitchell has been in federal service for over a decade. She has undergone extensive law enforcement training, has overseen major criminal investigations, and has clearance levels that exceed those of any officer in this courtroom. She knew her rights that night, and she knew that Officer Holloway had no legal grounds to arrest her." The judge exhaled slowly, now fully aware of the gravity of the case. He turned his attention to the prosecutor. "Are you telling me that this case proceeded without a thorough background check on the defendant?" His tone was calm, but the accusation was evident. The prosecutor hesitated, flipping through his notes as if searching for an excuse that didn't exist. "Your Honor, Lauren interrupted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. They knew. Holloway's jaw clenched. A muscle twitched in his cheek. The judge's gaze darkened. Then why was she arrested? Nobody answered. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest, it was something far more deliberate. And now, exposed in open court, it had become something far more dangerous. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it had become a battlefield. The truth sat heavy in the air, undeniable and inescapable. Lauren Mitchell had been arrested not by mistake, but by design. The moment her name came up in their system, someone had recognized it. Someone had known exactly who she was. And yet, instead of backing off, they had chosen to move forward with the arrest. The question was why. Holloway hadn't said a word since the badge was revealed. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but he barely acknowledged it. His face had lost its smug arrogance, replaced with a cold, calculating stillness. He wasn't just realizing his mistake, he was trying to figure out how deep it went, how much she knew, and how much damage she could cause. Lauren's attorney wasn't finished. He slid another document across the table for the judge to see. It was a classified memo, partially redacted, but still damning. The precinct where Holloway worked had been under federal investigation for over a year. The probe was centered on falsified reports, planted evidence, and officers who had engaged in targeted harassment against Black and Latino drivers. Some cases had led to wrongful convictions. Others had simply disappeared, buried under administrative loopholes and internal cover-ups. Lauren had been investigating them, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as an agent, and they had arrested her. The courtroom murmurs turned into a dull roar as the revelation sank in. This wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about a system designed to silence those who got too close. The timing was too perfect. Lauren hadn't even been scheduled to be in Virginia that night. Her work had brought her there at the last minute. But someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting for an opportunity to remove her from the equation. And they had failed spectacularly. The judge's patience had run out. He turned to the prosecutor with a sharp glare. "Why was I not informed of this federal investigation?" His voice was like a blade, each word slicing through the tension. The prosecutor's hands tightened into fists. He knew he had been played. Someone in law enforcement had fed him this case, assured him it was nothing more than a routine matter. Now he was standing in the middle of a scandal. Lauren spoke again, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Officer Holloway is just one piece. There are others, people in this department who have been covering for each other for years." She glanced toward the rows of officers in the gallery, watching their rigid postures, their locked jaws. Some of them knew exactly what she was talking about. Others had likely been complicit without realizing it. Holloway's lawyer tried to intervene, tried to spin the story, but the damage had been done. There was no defense strong enough to erase the fact that the man who had laughed in court had just handed himself over to the very people he thought he controlled. The case was crumbling, but Lauren knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. Lauren left the courthouse knowing the battle had only just begun. The charges against her were dropped within hours, the judge making it clear that the arrest had no legal standing. The press swarmed, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, but she ignored them. She had bigger problems now. Officer Holloway had vanished the moment court adjourned, slipping out a side exit before anyone could press him for answers. He wasn't just running from public humiliation. He was running from the people who had orchestrated this entire operation. He had become a liability, and in a system built on secrecy and protection, liabilities didn't last long. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, several officers from Holloway's precinct were placed on administrative leave. Their records were being pulled, complaints reviewed, and body cam footage from previous stops re-examined. The federal probe, once a quiet operation, had now turned into a full-scale corruption investigation. Lauren had forced their hand, and now the floodgates were open. Then, the first body turned up. A man found dead in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city. His name wasn't released immediately, but Lauren recognized him as soon as she saw the report. He was a whistleblower, a former officer who had been working with federal investigators, feeding them information on the department's corruption. His cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the head, officially ruled a suicide. Lauren knew better. She had seen too many cases like this. It was a message, a warning to anyone else who might consider speaking out. She checked her phone, scrolling through messages from her contacts inside the agency. The case was spiraling, and people were getting desperate. Holloway still hadn't resurfaced, but she had no doubt he was watching everything unfold. He was either trying to cover his tracks or preparing for whatever was coming next. Then a message came through. Unmarked number. 3 words. They know everything. Lauren's grip tightened around her phone. She knew what that meant. Her presence in Virginia wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been tracking her movements, following her work. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The arrest wasn't just about humiliation. It had been a test, a way to see how much she knew, how she would react, and whether she was truly a threat. And now, they had their answer. Lauren wasn't just a problem. She was a target. She closed her laptop, shutting down the encrypted files she had been reviewing. Every case tied to this department was now under active investigation, but she wouldn't be the one leading it anymore. The moment she had walked into that courtroom and exposed Holloway, she had become part of the story. The next move wasn't hers to make. She turned off the lights, staring out the window into the quiet night. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting, planning, and they weren't finished yet.